This is the first of 2 lectures on the female reproductive system. The same as we found for the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system contains gonads. They have ducts, accessory glands, and perineal structures. As we discussed before, these systems are functionally different. The female produces 1 gamete per month, and the male has the ability to make many billions of sperm per month. The female reproductive system has sex hormones and functional gametes that protect and support the developing embryo and nourishes a newborn infant. The organs of the female reproductive system include the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, sometimes called the uterine tubes, the uterus itself, the vagina, and the external genitalia. The ovaries, the fallopian tubes, and the uterus are found in what is called a broad ligament. And this attaches to the pelvic cavity, and it becomes continuous with the parietal peritoneum, the lining of that cavity. The fallopian tubes run along or within this broad ligament, and they open into the pelvic cavity very close to and lateral to the ovaries. We also have a structure that's called the mesovarium, and that stabilizes each ovary into position. So this broad ligament is a divider of the peritoneal cavity. And the divisions are actually called the recouterine pouch. That's between the uterus and the anterior surface of the colon. And then we also have the vesicouterine pouch, which is between the uterus and the posterior wall of the bladder. This broad ligament stops side-to-side movement and rotation of the organs of the female reproductive system. There are also other ligaments within this mesenteric sheet of the broad ligament, and they prevent up and down movements, and they are connected to the ovaries and to the uterus. Let's discuss this broad ligament that I just defined for you all. You can see the broad ligament is this mesenteric sheet that has the ovaries embedded in it. It is bordered by the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes. You can see them here. But I want you to think about how all of these structures are found within this broad ligament. Everything appears to be attached in some way. So let's think about a hysterectomy. So when a woman has a hysterectomy, by definition, that means the uterus is removed. Now, a woman can have a complete hysterectomy where she has both her uterus and ovaries removed, or she can have a partial hysterectomy where she retains the ovaries. It depends on family history. It depends on what the nature of the reason is for having the uterus removed. Also depends on the age of the patient. If a woman has to have a hysterectomy when she is younger, many times she's allowed to keep her ovaries so that she can continue to produce hormones. But let's think about this. So the uterus is removed. Well, where is the uterus removed, and how does that occur? Well, let's clear up one thing first. So oftentimes you'll hear that there are 3 organs that are in line with each other. You have the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina. So we have the uterus, the cervix, and then we have the vagina. All right, so let me clear up one thing for you. The cervix is part of the uterus, right? It is the posterior opening to the uterus, but it is part of the uterus. So when a woman has a hysterectomy, she can have something that is called a supracervical hysterectomy, where the uterus is removed right here, where the cervix is retained. Or she can have a hysterectomy where the cervix is also removed. If the woman has a short vaginal canal, they might retain the cervix. It is also thought that the cervix has some relationship to sexual satisfaction. So at times the cervix may be left for that reason. Oftentimes it's up to the discretion of the surgeon. Now, if the woman has a history of cervical cancer in her family, then clearly the cervix will be removed. But let's go back to just thinking about a hysterectomy. And let's think about a partial hysterectomy where the woman will keep her ovaries. I want you to look at the attachment of the ovaries. They're attached here on each side, that's the ovarian ligament, and then they're attached here by suspensory ligaments. So if the uterus is removed, all of these structures, to include the fallopian tubes, is removed. So what happens to your ovaries? They are only then attached by the suspensory ligament. Well, your ovaries are tacked to your posterior or dorsal pelvic wall. They are tacked into place. Another thing I'd like for you to think about is what happens at this inferior attachment. So the cervix is removed and the vagina is essentially a tube. What happens? Well, that tube is stitched shut. All right. Another thing I would like for you to notice is, let's look at these ovaries. So this is a great image. What you can see right here is there is an ovary that has the fallopian tube that lays close to it. So if you go to this picture over here, you can see that if you think of my left fist as the ovary and my right hand laying on top of that ovary, that would be the fallopian tube with the opening to the fallopian tube. These two structures are not physically connected. They are associated with each other, but they are not physically connected. All right. So, the ovaries, small almond-shaped organs, about the size of an almond. They weigh 6 to 8 grams apiece. They produce oocytes, which are the immature female gametes. They also allow for the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, and they secrete inhibin. And again, inhibin has the same function here in the female reproductive cycle as it has in the male reproductive cycle, which is to control pituitary follicle stimulating hormone. We've already looked at the support of the ovaries with the mesovarium, which is that portion of the broad ligament right here, which is a sheet. The suspensory ligaments, which you can see right here. And then we also have the ovarian ligament right here. Oogenesis is also called ovum production, and it begins before birth, it speeds up at puberty, and it ends at menopause. I think this is a good time to clear up some terminology. Often you will hear said that an egg and a sperm come together at fertilization and that produces a zygote. To be absolutely correct, the exact terminology is a secondary oocyte is what is ovulated, and that secondary oocyte is what is fertilized. And only after fertilization occurs, after ovulation, will meiosis II complete. Okay, so this secondary oocyte is this structure right here that I've just made an X on. And that secondary oocyte is what will become fertilized. If fertilization happens, then this structure is what is formed, but it already has been fertilized. All right. Also notice that we have polar bodies being produced. After meiosis I, we have one polar body produced. And what may or may not happen is that polar body may actually go through meiosis II. So we know for sure the number of polar bodies produced in meiosis I is 1, but it could be 2 if this occurs. Meiosis II is going to produce 1 polar body. So the highest number of polar bodies that could be produced via oogenesis is 3. The lowest number is 2. The oogonia are also called stem cells for females. And again, it's the same process that we talked about with males. Here is an oogonium. Scratch that. Here is the oogonium. And that oogonium will go through mitosis and produce 2 daughter cells, one that will remain as an oogonium and one that will go through the process of oogenesis. Between the 3rd and the 7th months, these primary oocytes that you can see right here will prepare for meiosis, but they stop at prophase of meiosis I. So this is where the stop occurs. The term atresia means that primordial follicles have degenerated. So a primordial follicle is a structure that women have in their ovaries. They have about 2 million primordial follicles at birth, and each has a primary oocyte. But by puberty, the number of follicles drops to about 400,000. So that seems like a huge drop. We started with 2 million, and then by the time a female is 11 or 12, those follicles drop to 400,000. But let's do a little math. So if a woman starts ovulating at 10, this makes the math easy. She ovulates 12 secondary oocytes a year. And again, to make the math easy, let's say she goes through menopause at 50. So she had 40 years of menstruation or going through the ovarian cycle. That equals 480. So 400,000 is plenty. This process of oogenesis, we know that during this process that these primary oocytes aren't developing for 10, 11, 12 years of the female's life. They're in a suspended development. Then at puberty, follicle stimulating hormone starts the ovarian cycle. And each month thereafter, primary oocytes develop further. So when we think about this process of oogenesis, we know that the cytoplasm divides unevenly, and that is indicated by the production of polar bodies, right? So we have polar bodies that are produced. They just disintegrate. They're not found. They disintegrate within the ovary and in the fallopian tube. The ovary releases that secondary oocyte. It's suspended in metaphase of meiosis II, and then meiosis II will be complete upon fertilization. So when we look at the ovarian cycle, what's going on within the ovary? You can see that in this photomicrograph, we have follicle cells and we have the primary oocyte. And then as maturation occurs, and we get to the point to where we are getting closer to ovulation, you can see that the follicle and the oocyte go through multiple changes. All of this is within the wall of this solid organ called an ovary. And when you look at this picture right here, this is the picture of a secondary oocyte that is erupting from the ovary itself. It is a rather violent process. There are women that say they can feel when they ovulate. And so we can expect that they do feel when they ovulate, since it is such a violent process. Within the ovary, there are what are called ovarian follicles. All right, so we start here with primordial follicles, and each one of these primordial follicles has this little dot, which is the actual primary oocyte, and it's surrounded by follicular cells. So this combination of the primary oocyte and the follicle cells, they form primary follicles. So here is a primary follicle. All of this is occurring in the cortex of the ovary and occurs within egg nests. So after a female matures sexually, these primordial follicles are activated. And so one is activated each month, and it goes through different follicular phases, which are called pre-ovulatory phases. The follicular phases are pre-ovulatory, and the luteal phase is called post-ovulatory. So the first thing that occurs is the formation of these primary follicles, and they will become granulosa cells. So keep the term granulosa cells up close. Then we have the production of the secondary follicles. So here's a primary follicle. I'm going to move down to this next picture because it has more detail. Here we have the secondary follicles, and if you'll notice, there's a space, and there's fluid that accumulates between the actual oocyte and the outer layers of the follicle. The formation of a tertiary follicle, that you can see right here, occurs when that primary oocyte produces the secondary oocyte and that first polar body. Then that secondary oocyte drifts free, and that's what we're seeing right here, drifting free in the antrum. So let's look at this picture first. This area is the antrum, and this is what has the follicular fluid. So looking a little more closely at actual photomicrographs, the region that surrounds the primary oocyte is called the zona pellucida. So this is the zona pellucida. Inside, we have this primary oocyte. So this structure that I'm putting an X on, this is the primary oocyte. I've already shown you the antrum, which is the space, but there's another area that I want you to see, which is called the corona radiata. And I'll show you that to you in the next picture. But the corona radiata is made up of these granulosa cells. All right, so we have granulosa cells here, we have granulosa cells right here, and then granulosa cells here. But their presence becomes different once we have a secondary oocyte. So after ovulation, we have the tertiary follicle releasing, right? So this is the tertiary follicle that is releasing that secondary oocyte. Again, this is the tertiary follicle. This is a tertiary follicle releasing that secondary oocyte. But notice what goes along with that oocyte is the corona radiata. Once the oocyte's been ovulated, we have this space left, which was a follicle. And this is now called a corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum produces progesterone at high levels, estrogen at moderate levels, and it also produces inhibin. Progesterone is necessary for preparing the uterus for pregnancy, and so oftentimes it is called the hormone of pregnancy. But if fertilization does not occur, this corpus luteum will degenerate and it fills with scar tissue and it becomes the corpus albicans. So here is a picture of the corpus albicans. All right, it's not labeled in this picture, but this is the corpus albicans. The uterine tubes, otherwise known as fallopian tubes, sometimes called oviducts, they're muscular, about 13 centimeters in length, and are hollow. And it is their job to move the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. You can see in this image that we have the fallopian tube on each side, and you can see where it enters the uterus. Also, when you look at it on the histological level, you see the lumen, and you can see that it is a thick tube. You can see the thickness of the tube. And you can also see smooth muscle. If we had another slide, you would see both circular and longitudinal bands. It's not that easy to see in this slide. There are 3 segments to the fallopian tube. The first one that we're going to look at is the infundibulum, and that is the hand. As part of the hand, you have these tiny little fingers that are called fimbriae. So it's an expanded funnel. It's near the ovary. The fimbriae extend into the pelvic cavity, and the inner surfaces are lined with cilia, and they beat toward the middle segment, which is called the ampulla. The ampulla would be like your elbow. This is the middle segment, has smooth muscle layers, and the walls become thick as they approach the uterus. So as we move down, we get to what is called the isthmus, which is a short piece between the ampulla and the uterine wall. The structure of the uterine tube is quite interesting as it has mucus secreting cells, and there's concentric and longitudinal layers of smooth muscle, and there is ciliary movement. So you have tiny cilia that are beating. It has mucus to help move the oocyte, and we have these peristaltic contractions in the walls of the fallopian tube. Before a female ovulates, nerves from the hypogastric plexus will turn on this beating pattern of the cilia and start peristalsis. And it actually goes on for 3 to 4 days because that's the length of time that it takes for an oocyte to go from the infundibulum, which is the hand, to the uterus. The oocyte needs to meet sperm within 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. And this event, fertilization event, if it occurs, typically occurs close to the boundary of the ampulla and the isthmus. Sperm and the developing pre-embryo, and we'll discuss the pre-embryo in just a minute, need nutrients, and that too provides nutrients such as lipids and glycogen. If an oocyte goes unfertilized, it just degenerates, either within the fallopian tube or within the uterus itself.